I welcome you again to the UNU-INWEH public event, the Science Talk. For those of you joining us for the first time, you're welcome. We're glad you can make it today. Thank you. I am your host, Professor Grace Oluwasonya. Before presenting our distinguished speaker for this morning, please note that there will be an interactive Q&A session at the end of the presentation. At that point, there will be room for comments, Q&A, and any other contributions. Please type your questions or comments in the Q&A chat box, and we will pick them up from there at the right time. Thank you. Also, please note that all our previous science talks can be viewed on demand on our YouTube channel available at https://unu.edu/INWEH/science talk. Again, our previous science talks can be viewed on demand on our YouTube channel at unu.edu/INWEH/science talk. The topic of today's talk is modeling shared waters, adaptive strategies for equitable water access. So let's talk. Our presenter is Professor Alain Pietroniro. Alain, I hope I pronounced that correctly. So who is Professor Alain? Professor Alain is the professor and Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Water Systems in a Changing Climate at the first UNU hub at the University of Calgary, Canada. Its research focuses on improving, developing, and evaluating hydrologic models and understanding the sensitivity of water resources to climate variability and change. He has served as the Executive Director of the National Hydrological Service, including the Water Survey of Canada for Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC, for 15 years. Before that, he was a research scientist at the National Hydrology Research Center in Saskatoon for 15 years. He was the accredited officer for the St. Mary and Milk Rivers for Canada for about 10 years, and he was the hydrological advisor for Canada under the World Meteorological Organization during his tenure at the NHS. He is widely published. In fact, he had published over 120 peer-reviewed papers and contributed to many book chapters and special publications. So who better to talk to us about modeling shared waters, citing the transboundary St. Mary and Milk Rivers basin between the USA and Canada as case studies. Join me in welcoming Professor Alain.
Hey, Grace. Okay, hello, everybody, and thank you, Grace, for the kind introduction. Yeah, so what I thought I'd do today is give you a little bit of background on sort of the mandate of ECC. For those of you who maybe aren't familiar with how things work in Canada, we'll talk a little bit about how it works in the Canadian context, right? And I'll talk a little bit about the IJC, sort of what it's all about. As an organization that's basically a transboundary organization, it's kind of unique in the world. I think there's lots of I guess issues between various countries on rivers, and Canada, US in some ways is no exception. Except what's pretty exceptional at the end of the day is how things have been managed through the IJC. So I'll give you a bit of background there, and I'll talk a little bit about a study that we're working on right now that I'm co-chairing on sort of the process of how those things get developed, how we engage different groups, and a few of the results and what we're trying to achieve in that study. So hopefully that gives you a flavor. It won't be super technical, but it gives you a flavor of how things work between the US and Canada, and also sort of sets the stage a little bit for what the NHS is and who manages what, I guess, with respect to waters in Canada. So this slide is pretty important if you haven't really worked in Canada or you're trying to get your head around how things work in Canada. So the British North America Act, which is basically the forerunner to the Canadian Constitution, basically said that the provinces are largely responsible for natural resources. Water is considered a resource. And so largely the mandate falls to them. So if you think about things like flood forecasting or other things, any kind of water management, it's really a provincial responsibility. And there's always that tension, federally and provincially between who's supposed to do what. But even within Canada, we have transboundary waters, right? And so, you think about the Saskatchewan River, or even the Winnipeg Basin in general, right? Those are all transboundary as well. So there's agreements that sort of govern how water is managed between the provinces and obviously between the US and Canada. So in terms of how, so the Environment Act, the Canada Water Act, the International Rivers Improvement Act, and the International Boundary Waters Treaty Act. So Canada's governed by acts, right, that say what the rules are, basically. And so ECC, so Environment and Climate Change Canada, is largely responsible for most of what goes on federally with respect to water. There's a couple of exceptions, and within ECC, I'd say, at least on the water quantity side, it's mostly through the Met Service within ECC. So that's where the National Hydrological Service sits. There's also the Science and Technology branch where the Water Quality Monitoring Program is and where their research programs are. There's an International Affairs branch as well. And there's a Strategic Policy branch. So those are all within ECCC. And then when you step out, there's Global Affairs Canada. There for the transboundary, there's the US-Canada office that maintains basically the relationships with the US. Natural Resources Canada is involved on the Columbia River Treaty as an example. Fisheries and Oceans Canada, when it comes to fish habitat, is largely responsible, even on the transboundary. And there's a few others as well. Federally, there's Public Safety Canada that deals with flooding and floodplain mapping and those kinds of initiatives. So lots of players. It's a little fragmented, and now that we have the new Canada Water Agency, part of their role, I think, is to try to bring this all together, so it's a little more cohesive, at least at the federal level, and then work with the provinces to make sure there's not a lot of duplication and overlap. So National Hydrological Service is kind of interesting because it was kind of formulated around 2017, I guess, as an actual service within the federal government. These things never get really announced. They just kind of form. And so, I was there at the time. Basically, what existed previous to what we now call the National Hydrological Service was the Water Survey of Canada, which still exists, but it's part of the National Hydrological Service. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but it's basically responsible for stream flow monitoring across Canada. It's a cost share program with the provinces and territories. And basically the program operates about 22 hydrometric stations across Canada. You can see the map in the right there that shows you kind of location of those stations. But it's also responsible for water management. So that includes international and domestic water management boards, where engineers in the program are responsible for doing all kinds of things. It also works on reference studies, and I'll explain those in a second. And it also does some hydrological, hydraulic, and eco-hydraulic modeling activities. So where there's a water of federal interest, so think about this, let's say the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is largely federal. So that program, when I was there, we ran hydraulic models for the Seaway to look at certain things. So those are all part of the mandate. If you look at the transboundary, there's a map on the bottom there. So all of those basins, really, there's 13, I think, in all that the IJC is responsible for. And so ECC actually has engineers or policy people involved in all of those basins. Always nice to look at history and do a little bit of historical context. So the Water Survey has been around a long time, longer than the departments have been around. It was basically started 100 years ago. It was the Minister of Interior at the time. He was an MP from Edmonton. And the motivation for starting the Water Survey, much like what you saw in the US actually, was the irrigation expansion in Western Canada. So there'd been no systematic surveys of water supply across Canada. And so in about 1909, 1908, There were 17 stations established in the water survey. So that was the first systematic surveys. There had been gauging done at different places, like in Quebec and Ontario, but this is really the first systematic surveys that were documented federally. And so that was an appropriation made by Parliament in 1908. And then 1909, they started doing the surveys. It was interesting because the person with the big mustache there, it must be Movember. He was the first engineer in charge of the program. So I never had the mustache, but that was kind of my job for about 15 years as well. And so there's a long history of basically having a chief hydrographer in Canada, and so he was the first one. Interesting enough, too, there's always been a strong relationship with the USGS, and in the US, the USGS is responsible for monitoring. And so the PM Sauter spent 2 years actually at the beginning, working with the USGS to develop the methods. And so the methods between Canada and the US and the standard operating procedures between both countries are very, very similar because the programs kind of grew up together. US started maybe 10 years earlier. So just to remind people, and I always like to remind people of this because hydrometric data, so what you see in the records through the water survey or the USGS or any other country is discharge, right? So it's a flux, it's cubic meters per second, right? And it represents the volume of flow passing a certain point every second. And so that's not really what's measured, right? What's really measured in most cases is water levels. Discharge is measured on occasion. It's probably measured 6 to 8 times a year, and that's really to develop a rating curve, right? And the rating curve basically relates discharge to height. And so that's what's used to actually interpolate and estimate discharge. Rating curves change, they shift, sediment, ice, other things. And you see in that figure on the right, that's an under ice gauge measurement, right? And so what you get is the backup of water. So you get an increase in head in the river, right? That's due to increased friction, right? For the same amount of flow. And so you have to adjust these curves constantly, right? And so what you see in the hydrograph, and that's just an example on the bottom, that's near Iqaluit, is basically a flow record, right? And so within that flow record, there might be 2 or 3 actual measurements of discharge. Most of the time it's water level, and most of the time it's related to the stage discharge relationship, which gets reevaluated every time there's a trip in the field. So when you see a hydrometric record, just recognize the fact that it's based on a stage discharge relationship, right? And so what that means is that there's basically an engineering decision made every day about what the flows are across every single station, right? And so that requires a fairly comprehensive program. It's not as simple as, let's say, measuring temperature, right? And so this is why we have national hydrometric programs, is you have to maintain a standard. And I think one important thing to remember, and I've said this for years, is that the data in Canada, and I'd argue the data in the US, it's very precise, which means that basically we've got very strict procedures and standard operating procedures to do the work, but it's not always accurate because in some cases, you might have a very poorly behaved river, right, where you get a lot of backwater effects. And so those rivers are constantly being adjusted because of sediment or because of backwater. So it's always important to look at the data when you're looking at it. Don't just assume that the data is accurate equally across the country, right? Like I said, it'll be very precise, but not always accurate. So I just have this little video to show you. So typically what happens with the water survey is you have to measure, especially with the current meter methods, now it's ADCPs, but especially with the current meter methods, you have to measure basically flow at 20 locations across or you measure velocity at 20 locations across a river. Doesn't matter how big the river is, really, you typically measure that. And of course, in Canada, we have ice, right? And so when that happens, you actually have to drill 20 holes in the ice, right? And then drop in a current meter to take the measurements. And this gives you an example up in around INWEH, what it looks like to actually go in and drill those holes. And so there's a lot of work involved in drilling 20 holes and then taking measurements. So this isn't for the faint of heart in many places in the country. There's lots of occupational health and safety issues you have to deal with. And so it just gives you a sense of kind of what they're dealing with. So there's the hole there, right? And that's where you actually put in either an ADCP or so an acoustic Doppler profiler, or you put in something else, a current gauge to actually measure the velocity, and you do that 20 times and then integrate. So let's move on to the sort of the next part of the NHS, which is its mandate related to the IJC, right? And so because it's international waters, the federal government does get involved. It doesn't necessarily get involved in domestic waters, within the province, but it certainly does. And so the Boundary Waters Treaty was written in 1909, and basically the department, the Environment Act, which is only about a page and a half long, says that ECC shall basically carry out the orders, what's called the orders of the IJC, right? And so anything with respect to international waters is really put onto ECC to manage. And I'll go through kind of what that looks like for Canada in terms of who does what. So there's lots of transboundary waters. So there's lots of different, I guess, individual treaties across the country. And so basically, in terms of the Boundary Water Treaty, the way it's sort of formulated, again, this is started in 1909. I'll talk a little bit about the history there too, but there's rules about how you operate, I guess, across the transboundary, right? So typically it's water levels or flows. And so there's orders that are basically put into place. Those are essentially the treaties that say who gets what in terms of the water supply or how water levels are supposed to be managed for transboundary water. So we differentiate between international rivers, which means the water's flowing between the countries, versus transboundary waters. So you think about the Great Lakes; those are transboundary waters because basically the border goes through the waterway, right? And so the orders are basically the rules of engagement between the US and Canada, and that's what ECCC engineers typically look at to make sure that Canada's complying and make sure the US is complying. There's also references, which are studies, and I'll give an example of that with the St. Mary Milk study now, that really talk to, trying to make sure that we anticipate any kind of issues between the US and Canada, and that these studies go forward to maybe change the orders or to make some recommendations to governments. The IJC itself has no authority to actually do anything in terms of making changes, so they can't propose to build a dam or change the allocations. It's up to governments to agree, but the IJC is there as kind of a neutral third party to resolve or ensure there's no disputes between the two countries, and then they make recommendations to governments. So in terms of what the IJC is, so the IJC is basically a binational organization. It's not a government agency. It's supposed to work on behalf of the basin, not on behalf of either country. It was established in 1909. I'll talk a little bit about that too. And so, one of the things that started the whole IJC was the Article 6 of the Boundary Waters Treaty, which referred to the measurement and apportionment of water in the St. Mary and Milk Rivers. I'll talk a little bit about the geography there, but if you recall, I said earlier that the IJC or the Water Survey of Canada started in about 1909, 1908, and it started at the same time as the Boundary Waters Treaty, and it was largely because of water disputes in Western Canada, right? So IJC was formed because of an issue between Canada and the US for irrigation. The Water Survey was formed largely to measure flows in Western Canada to make sure that for irrigation expansion. And so those two things kind of dovetailed. So there's been a long history in Canada between the IJC and Environment and Climate Change Canada now, or the Water Survey at the time. So just to give you a flavor, I showed this earlier, but this is kind of the 13 treaties or agreements between Canada and the US. So going from west to east, there's St. Croix River, right, which flows between the US state of Maine and New Brunswick, right? There's the Lake Champlain, there's the That was a study board that was one of those reference that was set up. There's International Lake Ontario, St. Lawrence River Board. That's a really complex treaty. There's the Niagara Board of Control that looks over Niagara Falls. There's multiple Great Lakes Advisory Boards. There's the Lake Superior Board of Control and others, right? And so you can see that these cover basically the transboundary. The Yukon is a transboundary basin as well, the Yukon River, but it's not subject to any treaties. So if you look at it, basically there's about 15 distinct basins. There's lots of rivers and lakes. If you add up the whole drainage area that the IGC is actually responsible for, it works out to be about 2 million square kilometers. So I think the European Union is about 4.5 million square kilometers, something like that. So it's about half the size of the EU. So that's a lot of territory to be responsible for. In terms of their governance, this is what they look like. This is the current commissioners. The commissioners are appointed by governments, right? And so in Canada, Pierre Baril was just appointed maybe 6 months ago. And some of these commissioners have been around for a long time. So they go through an order in council to get appointed in Canada. So the jobs are actually applied for, which is interesting. They used to be political appointments, but now people apply on them. But then they do have to go through cabinet to get approved, and that's how it works in Canada. In the US, they're actually appointed directly by the president's office, and so they're typically people that were involved in in politics in the US that get basically these positions on the US side. So when the government changes, they typically resign on the US side and then new ones are appointed, not so much in Canada. So there's also staff. So there's 3 offices. There's the Canadian section in Ottawa, and Washington there's the US section. So there's staff that look after everything. And then there's in the Great Lakes, there's actually a shared office between the US and Canada in Windsor. In terms of people working on IGC boards and committees, it goes up and down, but typically there's about 200 people across the country, and most of them on the Canadian side, ECC. In the US, it would be people in the US Army Corps of Engineers, or it could be the USGS, or it could be NOAA. And so depending on the nature of the treaty, different people get involved. So I'll just go through these quickly. These are basically the different orders that are around for the IJC. Will go from west to east. So there's the Soyuz Dam or Soyuz Lake, Zozul Dam. So basically that treaty is essentially tells you what the water levels, because the water levels actually back up over to the US, and they basically dictate the water levels that are acceptable between both countries. So depending on the inflows and the outflows, the engineers responsible for that specific board of control will ensure that waters are released through the dam to make sure that the water levels between both countries are between certain levels, certain points, right? There's an International Columbia River Board of Control. They were established in 1941. So there's basically the Grand Coulee Dam that affects water levels across the country, right? So again, it's the same idea. Water levels are monitored by the Water Survey and the USGS, and they need to meet basically certain levels that are agreed to by the US and Canada, and the IGC just ensures that happens. International Kootenay Lake of Control. So there's the Coralin Dam. Again, that's a transboundary dam, right? And so basically there's an apportionment agreement. So how much the US versus Canada gets. So again, ECC would co-chair that on the Canadian side, and there'd be a US co-chair as well. And we'll talk about this one a little more deeply. So that was established in 1909, the treaty. And then there's an order of 1921. But basically, it's the measurement of natural flow and the apportionment of water. So, but there's no backwater here. There's no lake, and so what this is basically an agreement between the U.S. and Canada on who gets what water for essentially for irrigation, but for other purposes as well. The Sewers Board. So there was an International River Sewers Board. And there was a study, and that was recently completed, where recommendations. There was a big flood in 2011 on the U.S. side in a town called Minot, North Dakota. So when that flood happened, there's 3 reservoirs in Saskatchewan that actually, it's an interesting situation where the U.S. Army Corps had paid for storage in those reservoirs. So there's Saskatchewan-owned reservoirs. They're used for cooling of coal-fired plants. And the U.S. Army Corps really couldn't store any water on the U.S. side of the border. And so they asked Canada and, in a sense, Saskatchewan to allow for storing the 100-year snowfall event, which Canada agreed to. And so the U.S. actually paid for extra storage in the basin. And then in 2011, there was a flood. What's interesting there was it was a summer flood, which never occurred in that region. So it occurred in July. There was, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of damage. There was a lot of finger pointing that Canada didn't operate the dams properly. And so basically a reference was established and we looked into it. And the end result was actually the dams shaved off the peaks and actually did their job. Just the bottom line was the flows and the amount of water coming into the basin was so large. There's so much precipitation that year. There was very little that could have been done, but there are some recommendations made about how to better manage the infrastructure on the Canadian side and establish better relationships. So those kinds of things happen, right? And that's why these references are put into place. There's the International Red River Board as well. It's a lot of it's focused there on water quality because of sediment and nutrient loads going into Lake Winnipeg from the U.S. So basically that one focuses a lot on ecological health, but there's also a working relationship between U.S. and Canada on flood control as well, because as you know, Winnipeg tends to have fairly frequent floods, and so a lot of that comes from the Red River from the U.S., right? And so there's agreements on there's no big control structures, but at least there's agreements on forecasting and flood forecasting for the region. There's the International Rainy Lake of the Woods Watershed Board as well. That's an interesting one because Rainy Lake is both an interprovincial lake, and so there's a treaty between Ontario and Manitoba on that one that the federal government's involved with, but there's also a treaty between the U.S. and Canada on water levels on the Lake of the Woods. So there was like in 2015 there was a rule curve review to look at, okay, how do we actually operate this lake? It's obviously controlled mostly by Manitoba Hydro, and so there's rules around that as well. And so there's ECC has a role there to monitor that. There's International Lake Superior Board of Control. A lot of people don't realize that there's actually control structures on Lake Superior that dictate how much water comes out of that lake. And so there's outflows that are basically based on a plan, right? And so the engineers in ECC typically would work with the US to make sure that those outflow targets are reached and the water level targets are reached as well. There's the control works on the Niagara. So a lot of the Niagara Falls actually gets diverted through power production, and there's agreement between the US and Canada on who gets to use which water for power generation. And so there's also the installation of an ice boom every year, although that's happening less and less. And so they basically manage, there's also static flows for that come over the border for the falls, right? And so they manage all that between the US and Canada. A big one here is the International Lake Ontario St. Lawrence River Board. That's a really complex board because basically there's the Moses Saunders Dam that essentially controls the Lake Ontario. There's a plan that sort of regulates what the water levels on that lake should look like. When there's a lot of water coming in the system, like in 2017, there's places in New York that actually get flooded. There's low-lying areas on the eastern part of the lake. There's a lot of controversy because Montreal is a downstream community. If they release too much water, then Montreal gets flooded. The Ottawa River comes in at that point too. And so basically the Board of Control there really manages, flooding in Montreal versus flooding in New York State versus high water levels versus things like flows in the St. Lawrence Seaway. So 2017-18, they were very close to shutting down the Seaway, which is a huge economic impact because Lake Ontario levels were at record highs. And so trying to manage that is pretty tricky, right? And so the board actually makes suggestions and follows basically the plans there. There's also Great Lakes St. Lawrence Adaptive Management Committee looking at climate change. So those are kind of new entities, I guess, being developed by the IJC. And so now we'll get into a little bit on closer to home for me anyways, which is the St. Mary and Milk River. So that hopefully gives you a flavor of what's going on in Canada. So there's a lot of work that goes on to maintain these treaties and maintain good relationships between the US and Canada when it comes to water. And so we'll focus a little bit now on where it started and why it started and where this is. So for those of you who, just in terms of geographic context, you can see on the bottom there's the St. Mary Milk River. So it's two rivers, right? So the St. Mary river flows northward from basically Glacier National Park in the US. And there's Waterton National Park on the Canadian side as well. So the St. Mary River flows north into Canada and becomes basically part of the Oldman River system. Those of you who know that system, and it ends up flowing basically into Hudson's Bay, James Bay, right? So it ends up in Lake Winnipeg and then flows north into Hudson's Bay and James Bay. The Milk River starts in the headwaters. Its headwaters start in the foothills, basically, of the U.S. It moves up into Canada, right? And then you can see on the figure here, it goes back down and goes into the US and ends up in the Missouri system. So it actually ends up flowing into the Mississippi system, right? So into the Gulf of Mexico. So it truly is a continental divide here. Hard to believe, but that's what happens. And so what happened back in 1891 was in order to develop irrigation sort of east of, so I'll go back to this slide, if you go look at the Fresno Reservoir right in the middle of that picture there. So essentially there was a reservoir being proposed to build to allow water for irrigation basically in this part of the US in Montana, right? And so what the US was thinking about was diverting water between the St. Mary River, which is a high-yielding glacierized river basin, into the Milk River. And so if there's a lot of different sort of stages in that. So the US had planned to develop and divert water from the St. Mary. Canada basically said, we don't want you to do that because the St. Mary water is actually in the Saskatchewan system. It's Canadian water. We don't want you to do that. And so there's a dispute between Canada and the US on how to deal with that. And so because of that dispute, Canada started building what they call the spite ditch to move water back into the St. Mary. So if I go back to the map, and I don't know if you can see my mouse, but if you look at sort of where the Milk River is right there, so you can see the water. So the idea was to move water from the St. Mary on the US side into the Milk River on the US side. And so when that water moves, it comes back into Canada. So Canada started building a spite ditch to take water back from the Milk River and put it back into the St. Mary, right? And so the spite ditch, and I've got a picture of it here. That's the spite ditch that was never really done in Canada, but it was a move to basically move water from the Milk River back into the St. Mary River to spite the US for diverting the water. And so that's what caused basically the formation of the Boundary Waters Treaty, was to resolve that issue. And so what happened was in 1909, the Boundary Waters Treaty was formed. And for Canada, currently the accredited officer is Wayne Jenkinson. He's the director of the Hydrological Service. He's got a field representative. And then in the US, it's John Kilpatrick. And so those people really look after the treaty and look after basically the water apportionment between each country. So it's an interesting history. It's started the whole thing off, right? And it's still in place today. The responsibility of the credit officers is really to determine natural flows at the border, determine the amount of water each country is entitled to, and I'll talk about that in a second. And it says operate the irrigation works of either country, but that's actually not the case anymore. The irrigation works are operated by the province of Alberta in Canada, but it's through the agreement with the federal government. And then they report the measurements to international gauges, and they look for any disagreements between both countries. So just to give you a sense of the infrastructure, so if you remember the picture before, and you can see the inlay there on the right-hand side. So what was proposed, which is pretty interesting from an engineering perspective, is the St. Mary River. You can see it up in the top left there. It flows into Canada, right? In the international border, there's a gauging station there. And so what the US did was they basically constructed a canal. You can see there the St. Mary Canal that basically takes water, and it's all gravity fed, which is very interesting, and it feeds it into the Milk River. So you can see that canal now connects basically the St. Mary River to the Milk River, right? And it allows for diversion of flow. So water that was supposed to go into Hudson's Bay now goes into the Mississippi River. And so when they started this, they built a reservoir to store the water so they could divert it. So that's Lake Sherburne, that's in the mountains, and that's in the Milk River Basin. They built a diversion, which is now being rebuilt actually as we speak. So that diversion is basically takes the water. So if you're standing there, you can actually see water going either being diverted to the Gulf of Mexico or going straight up to James Bay, Hudson's Bay. So that's what it looks like. And again, that's an old structure and that's being rebuilt right now. And then at point 3, they have these siphons. Because you're actually going between two divides, they actually have a siphon of water. So this is diverted water that crosses over top of the St. Mary River and goes back over into the Milk. And so these siphons were built a long time ago. There's a gauge house there with the USGS, and so they measure flows going through the system. The flows going through typically are about 600 CFS. The system itself was quite challenged. It was falling apart, and actually this past summer, those siphons blew out, and so those siphons are now being reconstructed. And so there's actually no diversion right now between the U.S. and Canada because the siphons failed. There's another set of siphons on Hall's Coulee, and again, sorry, and again the water's gravity fed through the system. And then there's drop. So there's a series of 5 drop structures that basically take the water from high energy level down into the river. There's a couple of crossings as well. So I'll just show you to give you a sense of what the rivers look like. So the St. Mary River is a very high yielding river. The Milk River, not so much. So this is what it looks like kind of at the border between the US and Canada at the western crossing. So it's still relatively high yielding, but it's getting into sort of that badland, dry kind of terrain. And this is what it looks like by the time it gets back across the border into the US. And so these are so you can see a gauging house there with a cableway. And so that's pretty much what the river looks like. And a lot of the water that goes in through that river is diverted water, so water that comes from the St. Mary. And that river, I'd say 1 out of 5 to 1 out of 7 years probably goes dry if it didn't have the diversion. And so that would limit the irrigation potential in Montana. So just to give you a sense, and we typically do things in dams cubed, which is a volume for the year. So the yield for the St. Mary is quite a bit higher than for the Milk. That just gives you the mean and sort of the standard deviation. It's a box plot of what the flows are. There's 3 other basins that are part of this treaty, the Lodge, Battle, and the Frenchman Rivers. Those are coming from Saskatchewan into the Milk River system. I won't talk about those, but those are also part of the treaty. So this is what it looks like in terms of apportionment. There's basically an order under 1921 that says that the basin shall be treated equally, although I think Canada did benefit from the treaty in the sense that the actual outcome of the treaty is that Canada tends to get more water than the US, but the entitlements are very clear on the St. Mary. Canada is entitled to 75% of natural flow, and the US is entitled to 25% of the natural flow during the irrigation season. And so that 25% is really what the diverted water is all about. So the US diverts water so they can get their share of the St. Mary water. On the Milk River, Canada's entitled to 25%, and the US is entitled to 75% of the natural flow. Outside the irrigation system, it's 50-50. There was a letter of intent that was put together in 2001, and it allows for some banking of water, if that's the right word. So the US can basically hold water back, so not give Canada its entitlement in the spring. So that allows them to store more water in Sherburne for later use. And they have to pay that back. And then similarly, Canada can actually use water in the Milk River above its allocation during June to September. That's kept track of. And so by the end of the year, those deficits have to be equalized. So there was a study done in 2006. There was a task force that put together kind of what's been happening over the years. So in terms of the total flow, the average Canadian entitlement was about 55%. The US entitlement was about 45%. The rivers are supposed to be shared equally between both countries, but they clearly can't happen because Canada gets basically 75% of the St. Mary, which is a higher yielding river. But if you look at what actually was received by both countries, Canada ended up getting more of its entitlement on average, about 60%, while the US got about 40%. So if you look at what that looks like in terms of the US receipt versus US entitlements, this plot kind of shows essentially what each country, what the natural flow was in terms of the entitlement, and then what the actual what was received or what was measured crossing the border. And so you can see in many years, Canada basically receives a lot more than entitlement. When the flows are high, it doesn't really matter because obviously nobody can use the water that's coming through the system. But when the flows are low, it does make a difference. And so even in low flow years, the US is not receiving, and in mid flow years, the US is clearly not receiving its entitlement. So as accredited officers, when I was doing that with John Kilpatrick, we looked at that. And so we came up, so as the accredited officers, the AOs, we came up with the idea of how do we try to fix this? How do we try to address this issue so that the entitlements and the waters received by each country are met? So we wanted to look at a whole bunch of, so we put together basically a proposal. A couple of other things with the treaty, it never really looked at First Nations water rights. It wasn't part of the discussion back in 1909. So we wanted to make sure that the First Nations were included. And so we put together this study, and this is sort of the motivation for putting that together. So John Kilpatrick and I approached the IJC and said we need to do a reference. And so that's what happened. So in about 2 years ago, a directive was sent by the IJC to do a study and to look at how we can basically manage water more equitably, I guess, between both countries to make sure that entitlements are met. There was a bit of a special lens that the IJC commissioners wanted. One was to look at climatic variation. So, whatever we propose, would it be sustainable with a climate change lens? Because that's important to look at. We have noticed over the years things have changed in the basin, and so that was an important part of this. They also wanted to look at aquatic ecosystem health, recreational users of the river as well. The Milk River is actually a highly prized canoeing river because it's got diverted flows, so it's kind of a guaranteed flow in the river most years. And so a lot of people like to canoe there, so there's recreational benefits as well. And then obviously the last thing was to actually engage the First Nations. So basically the idea for the study was to look at changes in procedures and infrastructure. So what can we do to the infrastructure to make sure that the entitlements are actually met? And so basically we wanted to do a historical and future analysis of what the 21 order allows. And we have to build in all of the water management. The slides I showed earlier had to build that into the modeling system. So we're looking at a few things, structural options. So right now the St. Mary Canal can convey about 650 cubic feet per second. It was actually originally designed for 850 cubic feet per second. And so what would happen if we enhanced the canal? What if we added storage? And so we looked at Lower St. Mary milk storage. So that's on the US side. We're looking at Canadian Milk River storage as well. And we're looking at Canadian conveyance alternative, which means basically allowing conveyance in Canada into the Milk River system. So those are the four kind of things we're looking at with respect to structural changes. And then we're actually looking at non-structural options. The way the treaty works is there's balancing periods where the US and Canada have to sort of balance the waters. There's the deficit trading that from the 1921 order. So we're looking at, can we change that? Can we look at a cap credit system to allow credits to be used over the water year? So this is all just straight bookkeeping, if you like, to look at the how we can better manage the water. So there's a study board. So those are the people on the study board. There's actually a whole governance. So the board meets every month. There's also technical teams from each country that were formulated to look at things like infrastructure options and water management modeling and that kind of thing. And there's also two advisory groups. There's a public advisory group and indigenous advisory group, and all of these things form kind of this study, right? So the study was $3 million over 4 years. It's not a ton of money when you divide it between both countries, but we pulled this all together. Just to give you a sense on the public advisory groups, basically there's irrigators, there's municipalities, and there's also people involved with recreation and tourism on the public advisory group. On the Indigenous side, it's interesting in Canada, there's very few First Nations reserves in the basin. Most people are outside the basin. You can see up top there in Nekaneet, there's a few land holdings that they have as a First Nation. In the U.S., it's quite different. The Blackfeet Nation has a large presence in the basin, actually, and there's the Fort Belknap community as well, and the Rocky Boy tribe on the U.S. side. So there's a lot more interest, I think, from First Nations on the U.S. side, but there is interest in Canada as well. And so the idea behind the Indigenous Advisory Group was to guide the study on looking at sort of Western Indigenous science to help us think about opportunities to share knowledge. They also provide input on the technical working groups. There is irrigation on the U.S. side that is run by the tribes on the U.S. side, and so they're providing technical assistance as well. And basically, the idea is to try to build a foundation for future engagement with First Nations. I'll go through this quickly. There's just a bunch of technical working groups. This is what they're doing. The climate and hydrology group is focused on looking at climate change, and so we've set up a series of models on the basin. Infrastructure options, those were described earlier. Water apportionment options, those were described earlier, right? So look at flexible apportionment agreements, basically bookkeeping. There's the water management modeling, which is kind of key to all this. And then we're doing some socio-economic analysis and some aquatic ecosystem analysis as well. The studies focused on mostly the St. Mary and Milk Rivers. The eastern tributaries are not really being considered here because it's just too much work for the scope of the project. And we're using existing water management models. So Alberta Environment and Parks, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation have water management models. And so we're using existing systems to do the testing. So this is what it looks like in terms of technical highlights. So basically, lap one is we did a first draft and calculations we did a lot of modeling in the first draft to kind of look at what's feasible, right? So initial setup of the water management model. So you see the little rocket ship on the right. So that's largely been done now. And so that's moved forward. We're going to move to lap two very soon. So we're looking at more robust modeling efforts, right? So looking at different scenarios and combinations of things. So I'll show you an example in a second, but if you just change the conveyance in the existing canal from 600 to 850, what does it look like? Who benefits? How does it work? And we're also running hydrological models. We're running the HYPE model. It's a Swedish model. We're running Raven, the Canadian model, and we ran PRMS, the US model as well. And we're running the mesh models. So those of you know the modeling scene in Canada, those are the models we've been running in the basin. So then lap three sort of starts pretty soon, and that's really into more model and refinement. So there's going to be a combination of structural and non-structural options that we're going to want to look at. And we've developed a visualization tool. So the idea here is to make sure the public understands what's going on and understands, what these different options will actually do to some of the entitlements and some of the other things that we're looking at. And finally, we hope to land the spaceship here. And so we want to write up all of the technical working group efforts, right, and present it to the board in December 2025. So next year we should have most of the work done and start making recommendations to government. We're looking at performance indicators as well. Those are things that people can understand, right? A lot of this is about engagement with the public. And so we look at things like, as an example here, fall river flows. There could be a performance indicator related to fish spawning success rates, right? So flow rates can actually influence that kind of thing. So, are we improving things or not? Those are the kinds of flow indicators we're looking at. Same thing with summer river flows, right? This is crucial for irrigation. So we're looking at those things. And basically the performance indicators are essential for measuring the effects. So what happens when you make a change? You change the conveyance, you change the storage. And then also for communicating the outcomes. People tend to understand these things. They don't understand the numbers typically, right, when you reach out in public meetings. And so you have to come up with indicators to help them understand that. So here's an example here. This is preliminary. This has not been published. This is very early. This is just testing the system. But if you change the canal, so if you look up the model scenario, we go from currently what's about 600 CFS in the canal to 850. What actually happens? Well, if you look at the historical record, and you say, okay, the US is going to receive 80% of its entitlement. How often does that happen? Well, in the base case, it happens about 10 out of 33 years where they receive their entitlement. If you increase the canal conveyance to 850, then that increases by 10 to about 20 times. So they'll get 80% of their entitlement 20 out of 33 years, basically, if you increase the canal. What that does to the Milk River is absolutely nothing, because that's all St. Mary water, but that gives you an example and a flavor of what can be done. So I'm kind of running out of time here, so I'll just go through this quickly. So the idea here is to develop these indicators, make them publicly available with that visualization package I just showed, and then go back to the technical working groups, go back to the water management modeling people, and go back to the public and look at the advisory groups, right? And then make an iteration on these models once we get feedback. So it's a constant feedback loop between the public, the Indigenous groups, and the government folks to make sure that we're not missing anything with respect to how we're studying this. So it's really continuous. We're now refining lap 1 and doing lap 2. The visualization tools are now ready, right? And so we're moving that forward with the study, and trying to get perspectives from stakeholders and rights holders in the basin. And finally, this is the last slide here. So basically, at the end of the day, we're going to characterize the water availability in the study, both historical and future scenarios. We are developing and evaluating the models, right? Looking at hydrological and water management models. We're looking at economic and ecological analysis as well. And the final recommendations are going to be both those structural and non-structural options to look at the preferred combinations of how we can do better accounting of the water and also maybe suggest infrastructure changes to governments to improve water access in both countries. And then what happens is these are presented to the international joint commissions. The commissioners look at it, they agree or disagree with what the board has said, and then they will make recommendations to government on what can be done. And only at that point can governments actually invest in infrastructure or agree to do whatever they're going to do to change things. So that's it. If you have, I guess I'll send it back to Grace now. And if you have any questions, please let me know. But hopefully you got something out of this and you learned a little bit about the history of the IJC and how things tend to work in transboundary waters.
Yeah, quite an extensive presentation from history. I quickly want to say I appreciate the time you took in walking us through the history of this. Otherwise, what would have been easily lost, So it took time, but it was worth it. It creates a good background and understanding of how transboundary waters can really be so complex and all that. And also, I want to also quickly mention the fact that the role of scientists in this space to avert transboundary conflict where water is concerned, because if you follow through with history, most conflicts, conflict has normally been around water, water sharing and all those kind of things. So with your presentation this morning, I really appreciate, the extent of what goes into managing transboundary waters. So it's not a mean thing. Thank you so much, for this. But quickly, for the sake of those of the audience that are not familiar with Canada, can you please explain again what ECCC means?
So yeah, so ECC is just a federal department, right? So it's Environment and Climate Change Canada. It used to be Environment Canada, and that's what houses. So they've got the responsibility for federal water management in the federal government in Canada. So they were formed in 1970, and so the Environment Act was put into Parliament in about 1970 as well, and it sort of tells Canadians essentially what the ECCC is responsible for with respect to its mandate. So,
okay, thank you for that. Another quick question. So the new agency that Canada just inaugurated, the Water Agency Canada. So where do they fit in into all this?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, the new agency is brand new, right? And so their role is a little bit still being worked out, I think, right? And so we like to think about things like boundary organization. So the IJC is an example of a boundary organization that really doesn't have um, like an official role in government, right? And I think what they're trying to do with the water agencies is make it a bit of a boundary agency, right? So that although it reports to the Minister of Environment, it really can work with the provinces and territories to perhaps come up with optimal solutions between the provinces and territories to limit overlap, to make sure that there's sort of equity across the different provinces. Some provinces are really big, some are really small, and so to try to normalize things across Canada. So I see them in the future as being like the Canada Health Agency, that really makes sure that everything, there's good dialogue between the provinces, territories, and the federal government, and there's good dialogue within the federal government as well, which in this case with respect to water. So that's what I see their role being, but they're still defining it and still working it out.
All right. So the outcome of this study fits back into ECCC.
No, it feeds back to the IJC.
IJC, okay.
And then the commissioners decide, US and Canada decide if they're happy with the study. And if they are, then the IJC will make recommendations to the US and Canadian governments, right? And then it's up to the governments to decide what they want to do and if they want to do anything, right? So then it's the Department of State on the US side and the Global Affairs Canada on the Canadian side that make a decision.
Okay, this is quite interesting because at the end of the day, whatever it is that you do in terms of this study fits back, into a real life issue surrounding water. So this I guess is a plus to the scientists who are working day and night behind the scene to ensure boundary waters are not only how do I want to put it? That they're not only functioning as they ought, but also averting any issues, because I was just trying to recreate the scenario in my head around the St. Mary and the Milk River, when Canada was trying to, they're trying to circumvent, water, and all that. So we need, a bit of maturity, and I just want to appreciate the role that scientists, do in kind of bridging and facilitating, on all the sites. Otherwise, I can't just imagine what could have happened if we do not have the option of, scientists coming in to say, okay, we can tackle this differently. Let's propose a study, see how things are, and come out with facts and figures that could really help inform decision in this kind of thing. So it is really very insightful. I mean, it's quite interesting. It's quite interesting. So thank you for what you do. Thank you for sharing. And hopefully very soon you come back again to share the outcome of the study. I mean, maybe by this time next year, because I can see from the timeline, hopefully by this time next year, you'll have been on lab 4 or be wrapping up lab 4, so we'll have a lot to talk about, and hopefully how it is being taken on in terms of policy. I also quickly want to say the integration of the Indigenous community, incorporating their perspective, is also a good thing to learn, from this, because at the end of the day, all primary water users, everyone is a stakeholder in this regard. So enough of the top-down approach, and in the test, University of Calgary said that book that you just published that was shared with us not long ago, I can see, someone, saying allow water to speak, that water also should have a voice. So allow water to speak, allow the indigenous community to speak. And because everybody is a water user at the end of the day, so I guess pretty much you're also saying allow everyone, to share their perspective on how this will go. So once again, I say thank you. A round of applause to Professor Alain. All right. So thank you. Hopefully come back soon to share the rest of the results with us. Thank you.
Thank you very
greetings
much.
to everyone at UNU-INWEH Calgary. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.